Thanks for joining us, everyone. I'm Trina Shanks. I'm Director of Community Engagement and Professor at the University of Michigan School of Social Work. I use she, her pronouns. Currently, I'm wearing glasses, short hair, earphones, a dark blue blazer, and a white turtleneck. If you want to press CC for closed captioning, you can actually see the transcription going on. And if you don't want to see all the people, you just want to see the viewer, if you push view, you could just do the gallery view and see the PowerPoint and the speaker. But really, I'm excited about our session today. We're going to explore how government issued photo IDs and the requirements for using them, excluding many from accessing basic needs, resources, and fully participating in society. So we have wonderful speakers who you'll get to meet in just a second. But before we get started, next slide, I'd like to take a moment to take a brief land and labor acknowledgement. Our Engage team is aware that we function in a society that has deep historical exploitation, stealing both land and labor, and it's affected and shaped our Indigenous and Black communities for generations. We're committed to acknowledging this in everything we do and to help create a more inclusive tomorrow. So we're going to take a few minutes to allow you to read our land and labor acknowledgement. So a few moments for you to take a look. Thank you. And I'd like to introduce our Engage team. Next slide, please. So you've already met me. Sonia Harb is our Detroit engagement strategist. Fatima Salman is our Engage program manager. We also have several student interns who are working with us as well. I think Zue and Parker and Debbie are maybe on the line. But with that, I'm going to hand it over to Aisha, who is our Engage program manager and adjunct lecturer and helps kind of organize these webinar sessions. So Aisha, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Trina. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Aisha Ghazi Edwin, and I use the pronouns she and hers. I'm a South Asian American person with curly black hair. I have glasses. A note about why we say that's an accessibility best practice, because this will also be printed out in a transcript. We want to make sure that everyone can read about what it looked like and what we're saying here. So as Dr. Shanks described, we have a really special session today that I'm personally really excited about that explores how government-issued photo IDs have been designed to exclude many populations from accessing basic needs and just fully participating in society. I'd like to take a moment to thank our Engage intern, Parker Carrick, for her in-depth research for the session. I also want to make a quick note to all the participants that this is meant to be an interactive conversation. We don't want this to be a formal presentation. I want this to feel like a discussion. So that means feel free to put comments that you have in the chat. We may ask you to unmute yourself to ask a question. We want this really to be a conversation. So next up, I would like to introduce our amazing panelists. So first we have Maria Ibari, who's the Deputy Director of We the People Michigan, Keita Cohen, who's the Attorney and Chair of the Washtenaw County ID Task Force and Ann Arbor Human Rights Commissioner, and Fimisone Owens, who's an activist who's also involved in Strangers No Longer and the founder of the Refugee Garden. And I'd like to just apologize quickly because I've noted that there are some tech issues I'm having with my slides. So if you see some of the font messed up, that is why. So next up, I would like to give our guests a chance to introduce themselves. So if you could each take 5 minutes or less to share your preferred pronoun, your identifiers, your name, and your organization and work. And Keita, I think you may have changed the slide to share your answers, which is great. So hopefully that also helps each of you in what you're supposed to say. And that's okay. That's okay. I can understand why you thought that. So Maria, why don't you first start and go ahead and share your name, pronouns, identifiers, so just what you're wearing, and a little bit about your work.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. My name's Maria Ibarra, she pronouns. I have long black hair and I'm wearing a purple and white plaid long sleeve shirt. And I am the Deputy Director at We the People Michigan, also known as We the People Action Fund. We have 2 sister organizations, same entity, same people. And I used to be an undocumented immigrant. I now, through many, many long years and struggles, I now very lucky to have received residency. But for many years living as undocumented, many years lived without having a license or an ID. So you know what it's like to drive without a license. And then I have spent the past almost 15 years working mostly with immigrant communities on various issues ranging from college access to deportation defense, mutual aid, and now work most closely with doing organizing and power building with undocumented communities. And our current campaign, one of our biggest fights is trying to win back IDs and driver's licenses at a state level.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for being here. And we're going to hear a lot about your work soon and for sharing your personal experience. Kita, would you like to go next?
Yes. My name is Kita Cowan. I am wearing a blue striped button-down shirt. I wear my hair very short, particularly on the sides. I have glasses, and sometimes you might see me with contact lenses. My identifier, and my pronouns are still she and her, but I left the identifier blank because it's sort of, I'm reconceptualizing myself. Right now, I definitely describe myself as an American descendant of African slaves. My work is grounded in human rights. I am in the process of establishing a new human rights advocacy organization that will encompass the work that I've done on the Washtenaw, the Kalamazoo, and the Detroit City ID. I'm an Ann Arbor Human Rights Commissioner and happy to be here.
Thank you, Kita. Thank you for joining. And we'll learn more about this, but Kita's also been really instrumental both at the county and the city level of Ann Arbor, Washtenaw County and City of Ann Arbor, in really pushing forward some progressive ID laws and changes and protections. So thank you for joining. Femistone, would you like to go next? And I know you also shared some slides with us, so feel free to ask me to go through them.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me here. Again, my name is Pimasan Kim Owens. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am wearing a purple shirt. I identify as a Southeast Asian woman, and I have long curly black hair with a touch of gray. I am also here a student at the University of Michigan. My work stems from my background as a refugee. I came here in 1981 at the age of 4. So I've lived through the experiences here that we're going to talk about as far as not having accessibility to transportation, community, language, culture. So part of my work here is I wanted to bring back our culture by talking about food sovereignty and how important it is to be able to have culturally appropriate foods here in Washtenaw County. Thank you.
Thanks, Femistone. Do you want me to share any of your slides of your organization?
Please.
So
again,
about.
Oh, sure. Again, my nonprofit that I started was is called Refugee Garden Initiatives, Cultivating Food and Connections. And I have a quote here that I really love because it does tell the story about a refugee that we have to have hope. It's to plant a garden is to believe in tomorrow. And I just started this again, just to repeat what I said, to pretty much to reflect on my experiences here. When I first came to the United States, we didn't have access to food. A lot of our grocery stores, if you go back into the 80s, I'm dating myself, but it looked much like a gas station. Everything was canned or frozen, and there was nothing really fresh. And I thought that, we could do better as a society instead of having to push and assimilate refugees into the American standard diet, that we have a place where refugees could come together and have community and be able to speak their language and foster that culture and pass down generational knowledge. Yes, thank you for sharing this slide. This here is our location, our first location, our clients. We asked them what they wanted to name this particular plot, and they named it Freedom Garden, which really says a lot. Right here, you can see one of the two plots that we had, just the beginning stage and what it looked like much after. And then another nonprofit that I'm very proud to be a part of is Strangers No Longer. Just really quick, I hope I do them some justice here. But in the fall of 2022, Sister Martha de la Torres, who is a Catholic sister from Mexico, as part of the Circle of Support, she created a platform to address issues like immigration. The number one issue that the constituents talked about was the need for driver's license bill and also the state ID, excuse me. What I appreciate about SNL is that they have representation in their circle. This includes undocumented immigrants who have been brave to come forward and to share their experience to make change. SNL organization now has a direct voice of people affected. So half of the board of directors include these people. And this is the same kind of principle I wanted to have for my nonprofit Refugee Garden, because it is very crucial that we hear from the constituents that we say we are impacting and give them autonomy and agency to speak for themselves. So the narrative, my message has to be, we are working with and not working for. We are therefore not saying we know better than the undocumented population what is best for them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pimisone. So at this point, I'm going to stop sharing the slides because there's been a little bit of a tech glitch, and I think that might be better because this is really, I just want us to have a conversation, right? So now I'd love to just dive deeper. You guys all have super interesting backgrounds and you're all doing really amazing work in this area. And I want us to talk a little bit more about it. So could we start off just by asking all of you, what is the main problem right now and who is being affected? You know, I do actually want to clarify before we jump in. When I refer to lack of ID, and when we do during the course of this presentation, we mean a lack of a government issued photo ID that might be issued by a city or a county or state or federal government. And it's hard to access for many people for a variety of reasons. We'll discuss that more. Do any of our panelists want to jump in here?
Sure. Can you repeat? You want us to focus on why it's difficult?
Why is having an ID important, right? And what is the main problem right now?
Okay, so I would describe the primary problem with not having an ID is as one of institutional requirement, and those institutional requirements are established by, I guess I would say, outside sort of political forces. But those political forces then filter down and do things like prevent folks without government issued ID from accessing soup kitchens, federally funded healthcare services, any low income housing that receives state or federal funding. And the list goes on. Banking institutions won't open an account for most folks without a government issued ID. And should you lose a government issued ID after opening that account, depending on who you are and what you wear, you may never be able to access that account again. And there are the basic needs that you lose access to, including utility services. There are the sort of, I would describe them as socially available resources you lose access to. Housing, most landlords, even in private housing, now require you to produce a government issued ID before they'll sign a lease. That's true now for almost every kind of contract. So we then have, of course, transportation issues that you're limited in terms of, well, as Maria indicated, you can take the risk, the criminal risk of driving without a driver's license, but that then of course exposes you to a criminal record and perhaps deportation. So without then transportation, you lack access to employment. Now let's just talk about employment as an issue because you, most employer, well, in the United States, every employer is supposed to require folks that they want to hire to fill out an I-9, and the I-9 requires you to produce a government issued ID. So you can't work without a government issued ID. A lot of libraries, believe it or not, still want you to have a government issued ID. And that's really tragic, I think. To pick up your child from school, you need a government issued ID. To participate in educational services, you need a government issued ID. I know, Maria, what am I forgetting? I had the pleasure, by the way, of working with Maria a long time ago when she first came out of school. Folks want to jump in because you lose track, and I'm probably missing some.
You know, it's everything. I mean, just if any of you drove to your work or school, everything requires an ID. The overarching problem is that the requirements to prove your identity have become harder and harder over the past, particularly over the past 15 years. This has been a national trend. And we're seeing this now actually with the push for a real ID. We have flown lately. We see in the airport, there's this national push to have even more stringent requirements to have an ID that then you can use to fly. It keeps putting pushed later and later. The primary problem is that one, it requires you to have a social security number in Michigan. And even if you have social security number, so this is more than just undocumented communities, even if you do have a social security number, it often requires you to provide either a birth certificate or a passport. So people are stuck in this like cycle where you need a passport to get your ID, but then you need an ID to get your passport or like your birth certificate. And it's just like this constant cycle. And there's no way to intercept that. That's for people that do have social security numbers. And then people that are undocumented and do not have a social security number, there's just no way that you can ever get an ID as the law is currently stated in Michigan.
Now that's true for the state of Michigan. You can't get a driver's license or a state ID. But as I was looking at my checklist, I forgot the essential last group, most important group, civic participation. You need an ID to vote. And in Michigan, you are supposed to be able to simply sign an affidavit if you don't have an ID with you. But I tried that and I was sent back to the back of the line. So if I had to work, I would have been standing there forever. The person I talked to didn't even know about an affidavit or where she might find it. So that's problematic. And that underscores, obviously, the push nationally for ID cards. I did a survey, and if you were born, say, in another state, I think it was 80% of all states require you to have a government issued ID in order to access your birth certificate. And that's also Michigan. So it's a catch-22, right? You need an ID and you need your birth certificate to access a Michigan state ID, right? But you need a government issued ID to get your birth certificate and your social security card. So if your documents are lost or stolen, or or they've expired, a lot of seniors have expired ID, it is very difficult. It can take years for people to get back on that ladder, right? So that's just a sample of how hard it is. And that's why folks end up just trying to live without. And as time goes on and they lose access to jobs, they lose access to housing, they lose access and connections with institutions that for a lot of people provide that secondary layer of institutions, right? Because what folks don't realize is, say I don't have the required list. If I can produce an employer's ID card and people are comfortable with that employer in that neighborhood, they'll give it to me.
Mm,
They won't make me come back. If I, for instance, produce a Michigan Department of Corrections ID, it may be on the list, but that clerk will probably be uncomfortable accepting it and they'll make me come back. Because believe it or not, the state is uncomfortable accepting its own state ID cards.
yeah, it seems like, and Pimstone, I want us to hear from you as well, but it seems like some of these, you know, required photo IDs, some of these requirements they're not implemented in a way that's consistent. It's very ambiguous, and it basically leaves it up to like
You want to get through?
the discrimination or the, you know, the subjective opinion of whoever wants to accept it.
Mhm.
And we'll talk a little bit more in a bit about how that actually we found is even happening here in Ann Arbor, a place where, you know, within the county of Washtenaw, Keita's done some work to help ID discrimination be combated here. But even in a progressive city like Ann Arbor, it's happening. Pimstone, do you want to talk a little bit about how you've seen this kind of need to, you know, prove the legitimacy of who you are? How does it impact individuals as someone who is a refugee?
Yes, I can answer that, but I also wanted to add to the conversation. My background is in food and sustainability, and I have to mention that a lot of the workers are undocumented immigrants. And I just want to bring up the issue that it is not fair that we depend on these workers when we cannot give them transportation. And in my background, my family, you know, coming as a refugee, that was some of the work that we could only have because it didn't require us to have English. So it's a very important job, but it really is hard work. And none of the citizens here really want to do it. There's a lot of breaking and just bending and for very little money. And the, I guess the environment, there's no bathroom for you to use. It's very harsh. And then you've got the chemicals that you're breathing in also. So these undocumented immigrants, they come and fill the jobs for us that we don't want to do. So it's only fair that we provide them with access to transportation. So I just want to share a little bit about my own personal story. I actually, when I was 16 years old, I applied for a passport. And back in my country, I had a home birth. So there were no birth certificates given. And when I had called the secretary or the senator's office to tell them that I don't have a birth certificate, the answer I got was very demeaning and very out of touch. And she said to me, "Why do you not have a birth certificate? Everybody has one. What's wrong with you?" Basically is what she said. So that's kind of to me very, you know, just microaggressions, just backhanded and just unnecessary. And I feel that there needs to be more of a platform to address how to bring other issues, that we are not just the standard American born with a birth certificate. There's other situations and experiences that are happening in the world.
Thank you for adding that. And also in the chat, we have a few things being asked. Dr. Shanks, is a copy of identification usable or does it need to have an official seal? And Maria, you answered a copy is usually not accepted. Do you want to expand on that a little bit?
I mean, I guess if you lose it and you have a copy, I'm not familiar with the Secretary of State. Maybe some places that are less like governmental, maybe a food pantry would accept a copy. But after a while, if it's expired, you can't use a copy to prove who you are, or you can't use that as like a proof that you had an ID in the past.
Other than a social service agency like a food
Yeah.
pantry, I would say most institutions are not going to accept a copy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And certainly the Secretary of State's not going to accept a copy. In fact, if you present a copy, it sounds off these alarms. And then they second guess anything you present. So I always advise people not to produce a copy if they don't have an original. we should wait and try to track down some originals.
And Mariana Moynihan, you have a comment. Hi, thanks for joining. I recognize you. Do you want to share out a little bit about what you wrote in the chat?
Yeah, I coordinate resources for unaccompanied children. So I work with the Michigan Immigrant Rights Center. So in coordinating resources, I run into a lot of documentation issues. So even food pantries who are entirely benevolent, this one made me think of it talking about food, access to food. Even though organizations can be entirely benevolent in just meeting a funding requirement for their grant or whatever by having to prove that people who access their food pantry are in a certain zip code or whatever. And the way they do that is to, put on their website or in their instructions, is to require that you bring in an ID. And that thankfully, it's something that since those organizations they do usually want to help these families, I've been able to advise them to take stuff like that off of their website because it's a deterrent to families. Some places are not as helpful, and even when I do speak with them and explain these clients are undocumented or underdocumented, so they might have a way to show what their address is, but it's not going to be this standard type of documentation that your staff are used to seeing. So there's definitely like a lack of training in that way, even for service organizations. Like Keita was saying that you were at the DMV and they didn't know what an affidavit was. So there's just like a lack of training in general. And there's the way people get like turned away or micro and macro aggressed because of, like if someone didn't have a birth certificate, things like that.
Thanks for sharing that. And, I want to just note here, we're talking a lot about undocumented communities, but this is an issue that also affects all different types of marginalized communities. And for a variety of reasons, like people who may be housing insecure, people who may be transitioning genders, people who are exiting the criminal legal system. I don't like to call it criminal justice system for a reason. There is a whole lot of people who are affected by this. And actually, let me pause and give you some numbers. According to an ACLU report, and this report was focused on voter disenfranchisement, essentially. And that's actually another thing that we should note here, is that these laws were purposefully implemented because they disenfranchise the Black and brown vote, right? And they've tragically impacted the voting turnout of these communities on purpose. And there has been at the same time this hysteria that there's immigrant voter fraud, right? And it's been used to really drum up xenophobia and hate by certain elected officials. And, according to the same 2021 ACLU report, there's actually only been 31 instances of voter fraud due to like identity issues in the last 10 years. And most of them were by accident. So that just goes to show how, there's a reason why getting an ID, a photo ID is so difficult. And there's a reason why the laws haven't changed. And the people who suffer the most are Black and brown folks who are marginalized in different ways. I want to quickly also just share some stats. So according to this report, it's 11% of US citizens lack a government ID. That's also 21 million people. There's an estimated 100,000 undocumented people in the state of Michigan alone. So remember, we're going to assume most, if not all, have no ID. And then an estimated over 1 million citizens in Michigan who lack a state ID or a driver's license. So that might include, this whole group includes both undocumented as well as other populations.
No. The million's just citizens. It's 1 million citizens plus 100,000 undocumented folks.
Oh, wow.
Mhm.
Thanks for clarifying that. Yeah, it's not an insignificant amount of people, right? And think about the impact those people could have on an election, for example. I want to shift the conversation a little bit to kind of the work that's been done in certain counties, right? To help address this issue. Kita, do you want to talk a little bit about the Washtenaw County ID project? Maria, I know you also have some history with the city IDs, I believe it's called, in Kalamazoo and other cities. If you guys could talk about that.
Sure. So the first idea was to break through the catch-22, where you can't access what's considered one of those primary gold standard ID cards, like a state ID, a driver's license, or a passport, without having a birth certificate. But you need a photo ID from a government institution to get that birth certificate. So we created a system in Washtenaw County that could reliably verify the identity of folks regardless of where they were born. We created a point system to do that, to try to tamp down the subjectivity and discrimination that goes on even when folks present ID cards. And that would give people access to a government issued ID that would allow them to access a secondary form of ID, like a passport or their birth certificate or social security card, if they can. And if not, it would be the highest form of government issued ID card that they could carry and hopefully would be useful, particularly in accessing basic needs, utility services included. So that was the original push, and that was fairly successful. We found there was a lot of interest in the city of Detroit, so we helped the city of Detroit basically utilize that exact same system, and they voted it in, and now there is a Detroit ID. Similarly, in Kalamazoo County, they modified it, carried it forward, and now there is a Kalamazoo County ID card also. So we have 3 local ID cards. A second round of problems that we discovered was that businesses would reject those ID cards as not complying with their requirement for an ID. And recently, so initially, we tried to break that with advocacy, met with some success, but not 100% of success, particularly with banks. And now in Ann Arbor, we have been able to pass, thank you, Aisha, a ordinance here that requires everyone in Ann Arbor to accept a government issued ID. It defines what a government issued ID is and mandates its acceptance if you require an ID. And the only exception would be that you deliver a service and that is subject to federal or state requirements where a different ID is required, or you have substantial and objective reasons to believe that that ID is fraudulent in some way. Now that's created a lot more interest both in the local government ID and in the ordinance. So I've been asked to work with Lansing. There's a group, East Lansing. There's a group that wants to establish both a local government ID and pass that ordinance. Also in Cleveland, there's a group that wants a local government ID and the ordinance. I think I was also contacted by one of the cities in Illinois. So the two together are helpful. The ordinance and the local government issued ID card. But I'll tell you that after 10 years, what I think I've come to understand better is that at heart, it's about our willingness to simply accept an institutional arrangement. There is, for instance, no reason why there are only state issued ID cards. There are no statutes that say only the state government can issue an ID card. but we've all become very accustomed to that being the case. We needn't accept that institutional arrangement if our state legislatures will not pass humane laws that will allow everyone to access what they need in terms of an identification card. Then we need to create other institutions, other governmental institutions to do that. So I think that we all have a right to what I would describe is an institutional arrangement that supports human life and does not facilitate cruelty. Right.
Yeah. And so the Washtenaw County ID project, so Washtenaw County ID Task Force project, you were the chair of that, Keita.
I am. Mhm.
And that began as, I'm sorry to cut you off. I just want to make sure that I also remember that began as the first project of its kind where it's allowing people who don't have all these documents to get an ID from their county so they can use it as legitimate, right? And
Yes.
accessing resources, basic needs. And it was the first project of that type in the entire Midwest.
Yes. Yes, that's right.
And one thing that I want to name that Keita is now referring to is, despite having, the only county, it's the only county, correct, in Michigan?
No, Kalamazoo.
Kalamazoo also.
Mhm.
And Wayne now with Detroit.
Right, but now they're the same program. Kalamazoo,
okay.
Detroit, and Washtenaw.
Yeah, but
Basically have-
Detroit is only a city wide, not a
Only,
wing.
okay, only citywide.
Mhm.
Just to give some background, and then I want to hear obviously from the other panelists as well. We found that discrimination was, even though we have the Washtenaw ID here, we found that discrimination was still happening in Ann Arbor, like rampantly.
Correct.
So from various, businesses, from service providers. So in a separate role I have as an Ann Arbor City Council member, I worked with Keita, who is the main architect of an ordinance that recently passed in the city of Ann Arbor, banning discrimination of that type. So banning discrimination against IDs, against the form of ID, as long as it's valid. It's a valid ID, it's government issued, you can't discriminate against it, and you have to accept it. So thank you, Keita.
You're welcome. But one of the things I just want folks to think about is what we're really doing is banning people from refusing service.
Yeah.
Imagine you go into a bank, they refuse to serve you. You go to a restaurant, they're refusing to serve you. And the rationale is the ID card. But the discriminatory act is that old-fashioned, we will pretend you do not exist and not serve you. And that's a problem that is unnecessary, because people will be surprised to hear the federal government has more lenient identification requirements than the state of Michigan. I mean, one of the things I did when I helped structure the Washtenaw County ID program was basically utilize the federal government's own methodology. And it didn't conflict with the states. But imagine the federal government, it's easier to get a passport than it is to get a state ID here in Michigan.
Maria, can you also talk about We the People's work on this and the coalition?
Yeah, so in 2019, we the People Michigan ran a campaign first to the Kalamazoo County ID had just been passed, modeled after the Washtenaw County ID. And then we were finding that even though this ID is available, the problem is that people still need to drive. And this is an ID, it's not a driver's license. So people were still being pulled over because they didn't have a license. And we ran a campaign to try to push the Kalamazoo County Sheriff to stop holding people for ICE. And we were successful. He committed to doing that. But that was just Kalamazoo County. And the problem still that the reason why people are getting pulled over is because they don't have a driver's license. So in 2019, we came together, 3 different organizations. So as We the People Michigan, 3. So We the People Michigan, ACLU, and the Michigan Immigrant Rights Center, and came together. And it's like, what are we going to do about this? Like, this is a big issue. We just came off a momentum of having won a campaign, and you know, a little bit naive, a little bit of like wild-eyed, and be like, should we do this? Should we like try to change this law that's been around for 10 years? So we launched a coalition called Drive Michigan Forward that now has about 20 to 25 member organizations who are part of that, with the purposes of bringing back access to state ID and driver's license. And for many years, from 2019 to 2021, we were working on this, being like, this is very aspirational. We're creating momentum. We know that we are going to need bipartisan support, because in every single state where IDs are available to undocumented folks, who've had bipartisan support. I think right now we're at 18 or 19 states that you can get an ID if you're undocumented. So we worked on this for a long time. And 2021, We the People Michigan ran a training program for undocumented leaders called Migrant Leaders School, where we trained 10 leaders across the state on the driver's license campaign. And two notable counties, so Berrien County on the west side of the state, southwest, and then Grand Traverse County, north side. We, through our PAC, through We the People PAC, decided that we were going to launch an electoral campaign to try to have a different person in office. Particularly in Grand Traverse County, the representative in that area, Rep. O'Malley, who was the chair of the Transportation Committee, had repeatedly blocked the driver's license bill, the old bill, from moving forward, had repeatedly blocked it and said he had no interest in moving forward. All the power that he had in that committee essentially killed the bill. Like, it was not going anywhere. We had no hopes of the bill ever moving forward. So we decided to support his opponent, Betsy Kofia, who used to work with us, who's running for state representative in that district. We ran a program where undocumented leaders who cannot vote and do not vote instead were working with their peers, with their family members who were US citizens and could vote, to make sure that they were either registered to vote or knew how to vote and who to vote for. So we ran this program where we had migrant workers and people working in the fields, apple orchards, cherry orchards, going to support each other. So we had a volunteer who'd be like, hey, you need to go vote. Like, I'll cover your shift to make sure that you have like time to go out and vote and like know who to vote for and like what this process looked like. So we did this 2 months before the election, and we were able to flip that seat for the first time in many, many years. And we have Betsy Kofia, who's now a champion of a driver's license. And we've been talking to a lot of people who essentially like study elections and are like, we cannot understand how Betsy won, because she had more votes than Whitmer in this area. So we were thinking that people would show up for Whitmer. They're not. Betsy actually was the driver of the vote in this area, and they can't understand where these votes are coming from. Like, we know where they're coming from. It's our people. It's people who are Spanish speakers, who have never voted, who have never in their lives have felt compelled to vote. And so this was happening in Traverse County. The same thing was happening in Berrien County. And for the first time in 40 years, we were able to flip the majority from a Republican to a Democrat. The tipping point was Betsy Kofia's win. She won by 700 votes in Grand Traverse County. We know that those 700 votes came from our people who have been organized by undocumented leaders that are now, for the first time in 40 years, and for the first time in 15 years since we lost driver's licenses, have opened up a pathway to make sure that we have the possibility of pushing this bill through. Because let's just be honest, that like Republicans are not interested in this. They're not, maybe there's a few that have behind closed doors and conversations with each other have said this impacts their constituents, primarily rural communities, but they're not openly coming out and supporting driver's licenses. In the past, this bill has been introduced 3 other times. We've only had one Republican support. He then lost his seat. And many people think it's because he came out in support of driver's licenses. So we have a majority, literally just by one. We have 56 votes, or 56 Democrats in the House, 19 in the Senate, and this is a year where we're going to win driver's licenses. The bill is going to be introduced next week on April 12th. We are waiting on the exact time, and we've been working essentially on, it's called whipping votes, making sure that we have every single Democrat that is supporting and has said explicitly that they're going to support, and also talking with them to make sure that, like, who are their Republican friendly peers who we can talk to, because we can't take any chances on just focusing on Republicans. I'm sorry, just focusing on Democrats. So we've been doing this. The part that is most exciting to me, that just fills me with so much energy and just like, it is unbelievable to me that we have undocumented Spanish speaking migrant workers that are organizing themselves and their communities and their people, and they understand the legislative process and why this matters. And to them and to me, this is not about an election. Like, Betsy's great, but like, this isn't about her. This is about making sure that we have dignity for our people, and that we're ready when we win driver's licenses, which is going to happen this year, that we're ready to go for the next big thing, which could be medical insurance, could be in-state tuition for undocumented students. But we already have the foundation and know how to fight, and have prepared our communities to be ready to take on the next thing.
It's amazing. Thank you for sharing that. And, you know, I remember when I met with you, I think it was January, you were telling me the timeline of like, we actually have the bills are going to be reintroduced. We're waiting for a hearing. We're going to have days of action. And it's amazing to just see how far it's come and the people that are championing it. But I think what's even more amazing to me, and it's something that really lines up with our values as social workers, is the necessity of involving those affected by the issues and leading to the solutions to those issues, right? Like undocumented folks, people actually impacted by this, know the nuances and the lived experience in ways no one else will, of how the lack of ID really impacts them. So that's amazing. That's amazing that you had undocumented folks who led this, basically flipped that seat.
Yeah, thank you.
So, you know, before we move forward in talking about the policies that are coming out last year, or I'm sorry, this year, I want to go back a little bit and talk about the history of why things got to this point, right? So, Fatima, if you could please go to slide 17. So, okay, and I'm sure, Maria, you also know a bit about this as well. So basically in 1995, there was a ruling that stated that there was no section of the law that really prohibited an undocumented person from getting a driver's license. And they could not be denied an ID on the basis of their citizenship. So it said citizenship has nothing to do with getting an ID or a driver's license. Then you had former Attorney General Mike Cox come along, who issued an opinion in, I think it was 2007, 2008, and it reversed that 1995 ruling. So he redefined the guidelines of Michigan resident to require that, no, that means a legal US resident. Those went into effect in 2008. And it had a really, I mean, it had a horrible effect on who could get an ID or driver's license. And it also showed to have a depressive effect on people accessing, you know, public assistance, these other things that we've been talking about. And again, this is something that's really fueled by this voter suppression movement, trying to suppress the vote of Black and brown folks. Is there anything else that any of our panelists want to add about how these rules changed from 1995 to 2007 to how we got here?
Well, I just want to mention that it also put up a bar for those that were housing insecure.
Yeah.
Right. Because by resident, they then began to mean you have a house and we can find your house. And if you can't prove that you live in a particular location, we don't acknowledge you.
Yeah. which is horrible.
Mhm.
Yeah. So I want to say that this is relating to a trend that we're seeing nationally, particularly after 9/11, where there is so much Islamophobia, anti-immigrant sentiment, and we saw many states put very stringent anti-immigrant policies. The pendulum is swinging on the opposite as we're realizing this is ridiculous and it doesn't make sense. But also there's a really big fear, particularly now because of all the things that are coming from Florida, that like perhaps this is going to be influencing a lot of the national landscape. It is very terrifying what is happening in Florida. And that DeSantis effect could be taking hold of people. So just being aware that like it's a little bit of the pendulum going back, but also fear that Trumpism, DeSantisism, whatever it is that we want to call it, is impacting the national landscape. And then for Michigan, this was an opinion piece. Ridiculous that like an opinion piece could have such power, but then it was codified into law right afterwards. So which is why the current attorney general can't just say, yes, we need driver's licenses and I have the power to undo this. She can't because it was codified into law right after Mike Cox wrote this opinion.
But, and I just want to add it, and deeply institutionalized by the Michigan legislature, not completely adopting, not wholly adopting the Real ID Act, but in effect adopting the exclusionary aspects of the Real ID Act, right? So it used to be possible to provide a wide range of documents to prove who you are and where you live prior to the Real ID Act, which was a, reaction to the 911 Commission's report. So Maria, I am curious, will there be a review of all of that, of all those ways in which the Real ID Act was institutionalized into the kinds of documents that would be required by Secretary of State?
Yeah, we're going through right now. We've been working with the Secretary of State to go through like what is the way in which it's going to be adopted into law. And have had conversations with them to make sure. I think the easiest thing that we're seeing is like, can we go back to pre-2008?
Yeah.
And having a variety of different documents that could be available. And I don't know, so all of this is held by our policy and research team. So I don't know the ins and outs, but I do know that we've been working with the Secretary of State's office to make sure that like they are understanding the way it's going to be operated. And apparently, I didn't know this, but a lot of the Secretary of State staff, people who've been there for decades, and many of them have already received word to be like, hey, we're going back to how we used to do things pre-2008. And everyone's like, oh, cool. Okay, that was easier. So that's great to hear that there's support from like the on the ground workers who are essentially going to be the ones that are face to face with people applying for IDs.
Yes, I agree. So there's supposed to be a trial run in Ann Arbor, one of the Ann Arbor Secretary of State offices. And I'm really hopeful that they are going to trial also the list of documents pre the Real ID Act in 2007. That's really exciting.
Yeah, that is really exciting. And I want to talk more about, I want to talk more about the bills that are coming up now. And also, Pimison, I want to bring you into the conversation and some of how you all have been organizing around this issue with Strangers No Longer.
Yes, that's right. February 28th, I believe, 160 members of Strangers No Longer got together, went to Lansing and demanded an audience. And they were able to speak to 65 legislators that day to show support. And also we had testimonies from the people, the constituents that this affected, and they were brave. If you can imagine, you're undocumented and you're going to the Capitol, risking, deportation. How important this issue is for them to do that, for them to set just a standard to speak up and to fight for what they believe is right. And I, as a refugee, I just want to say that thank you for, I'm so excited about the policies that are coming up, and thank you for all that you do, Kita and Maria. I, every day I live in fear of the next president, and I'm someone who has documentation, but I do live in fear that I will be either deported because of some technicality or something because of discrimination. And I think it's important to state that in order for us to make any changes and go forward, I think that the conversation needs to talk about what happened in our past history so that we don't repeat it again. A lot of this anti-immigration started way back then, way back in the 1800s. You take a look at the Chinese Exclusion Act. It excluded the Chinese from coming in. And then you look at the, for Japan also, the Gentleman's Act. And then recently you look at the Muslim ban, which out of fear has caused just discrimination against our Muslim community. And then, I also think about the internment camps, the Japanese who were interned illegally just because of fear. And I believe that a lot of these issues that we need to bring into light that it does stem from discrimination and from anti-immigration sentiments and rhetorics that causes a lot of fear, and also this notion of us stealing jobs. And I think that all has to do with why it's still not possible for us to get driver's license. I really do feel that there is the underlying discrimination, and it's still alive even for me as a refugee who has documents. I still fear every day of being deported or something happening if I didn't have my documentation.
And what that must do to a personal level, right? And yeah, you have mentioned something that's really important for us to think about and emphasize that this is not new. There has been an ongoing, discrimination that has run through our history as a country, and xenophobia against immigrants. Although immigrants and people from other countries really built this country, right? And there has been this narrative created that immigrants are not real Americans and part of American history when we are American history. This is today what we have is a reflection of what we've contributed, right?
So immigrants plus slaves built the country.
Yes, immigrants and slaves, yes. And when we think about the way that these requirements for photo IDs, disenfranchise folks, what else it does to our country, right? Economically, socially, what it does to individuals. I wanted us to talk a little bit more about kind of community impact. Fatima, if you can go to slide 24. I think that there's a little bit of a delay. But what this story is about, and Fatima, if you can go to slide 24, that would be great. Otherwise, we can also just talk about it, right? So I want us to talk a little bit about how the police also use profiling and asking for IDs as an excuse for deportation and to enter people into the incarceral system, essentially. This case was about a father who was clearly profiled during a traffic stop and then deported. And then years later, the daughter, who was driving, their aunt and mother, they were stopped while driving. And the police didn't even check the daughter's ID, just the mother and the aunt. And both of them were also deported. And just the impact on just generations of this family, right? And what that does. When I worked for, it was then State Representative Rashida Tlaib in District 13, I worked at her constituents office, and we talked all the time about how police again are trying to pull people over by profiling them. And they use the excuse of identification assistance, or I'm so sorry, we need to call language assistance. We can't understand you. And those were excuses to call ICE, to call Border Patrol, and excuses to deport them. Can any of you talk about just how you've seen this manifest at the real community level and the fear that it does, right? The fear that it brings to people.
I could share with the refugee community. So we came here because of war. A lot of us came when we were younger, just children. We're put into a society that doesn't really give us the resources. And our parents end up having to work 1, 2, 3 jobs just to make ends meet. So it leaves the children to fend for themselves. And a lot of these kids, they have, misdemeanors that's on their record. And recently, an issue with us is that ICE has come to deport any refugee that has any criminal background. And that was just an excuse to look into that. And what that does is it rips families apart. A lot of these individuals that are being sent home don't even know their own language, don't even know that culture anymore because they grew up here in the United States. This is their home. They have families, they have children. They're in their 40s, 50s, and they've already established it. And for them to be, dinged because of something they did as a minor, I think it's very unfair, but it is very real. When I talk about the fear of having I mean, I don't have a criminal record, but it is a fear even for me that I might get accidentally put into this if the rhetoric is so easily available to just deport somebody. So that is one of the fears with the refugee community.
Yeah, I want to
I
talk.
can
Oh, go ahead, Maria.
Oh, I can share. I used to do a lot of volunteer work with an organization that's still around, the Washington Interfaith Coalition for Human Rights, or WICR, and as part of the urgent response team in Washington County. And just the call. So pre-Trump, there was probably, we would get about 1 or 2 calls a month. After Trump, it would be about 5 to 7 calls a week. So it was like an explosion of the amount of phone calls we would get for support. These stories that I heard, I talked to somebody who ICE parked outside their house, followed them on the way to work, pulled them over a few blocks from the house, arrested them, took his keys, and then went back into this person's house and let themselves in using this person's keys, and then arrested everybody else who lived in the house. I talked to somebody who he had DACA, I believe, went to go pick up somebody who had been detained. I don't know if it was immigration or not related, but went to go bail somebody out. And then while they were bailing somebody out, the police was like, hey, I'm seeing that you have like a immigration case, like you're good, but your mom is not, like she's undocumented, like where is she? And essentially coerced them into turning her in. And then the mom got deported. I talked to somebody who they were smashed so hard against the car, they broke his fingers. And this is all happening in Washington County, Ann Arbor, that is supposed to be a safe zone that the police has committed to not working with ICE, but they're independent. ICE works independently of the police. Literally hundreds of stories. I could write a book of the most horrific, horrendous stories you've ever heard of people who've been impacted by this. Some ranging from just like, I just got stopped randomly, or I got stopped because I had a tail light out, or others like I was followed and stalked by ICE and physically harmed. Talked to people who've been detained in there during COVID. I was supporting a group of men in Monroe, the detention center, who didn't even have soap. This was COVID, and we had to do a soap drive because they were not being provided soap to wash their hands while there was a global pandemic going on. This is the kind of range of like things that are happening and are still happening. Now we are hearing less about it because things are supposedly not as bad under Biden, but they're still happening. People are still being detained and arrested and deported.
Disgusting. And Keita, I remember when you and I were talking earlier this week, you were breaking it down in terms of like the impact this has on people in terms of them just accessing basic needs is one thing. And then being able to form social networks and have a support system, because like you can't ride transportation with these ID restrictions. You're afraid to see people. And then at an individual level, what it does when you walk around feeling like you don't belong and there's a bullseye on your back.
It is. It's psychologically and internally damaging when you walk in anywhere for service, even something as simple as a drink after work, and people refuse to serve you, and people refuse to acknowledge your need for cold medicine, for your
Yeah.
child to have cold medicine. It's not embarrassed. People think it's just about embarrassment, and it isn't. It's deeper. It's much more the level of humiliation, of exclusion, of a degraded identity and personality. And it's something that people carry with them throughout their lives. And it is a deep wound.
Yeah. This is a fact that, I pulled up from this ACLU report that based on thousands of documents obtained through a lawsuit, it shows that nearly half of all arrests that resulted in deportation from 2012, 2017 began with state or local law enforcement initiating just a traffic stop. And the most common reason that they called in ICE or border patrol was for identification assistance, which is just ridiculous. The impact it has in a community. So I want to go back now to like what is happening today. Like, what are the bills? How can we help? And what is kind of the timeline? I know that you guys are waiting for a hearing now, right, Maria?
We're waiting for the bills to be introduced, and that'll be next Wednesday, hopefully. And then once they're introduced, they're assigned to a committee. In that committee, then they receive a hearing to be voted on that committee, and then they go to the full House or Senate, and then the same thing happens in the other chamber. And then go up to a vote with both of them, and then signed by the governor.
And do you anticipate any obstacles in either the House or the Senate? Or
Oh yeah, and both. So we've been working to try to identify which is going to be the friendliest, easiest committee to get it through the first hurdle. I think we're seeing that in the Senate is going to be the Transportation Committee. In the House, it's going to be the Rules and Regulatory Committee, which is the one that doesn't really make sense in, when people think about like what each committee does. But we are seeing and have heard that the chair of the Transportation Committee is not interested in moving these bills forward. Luckily, we've built the leadership of the House, like we have relationships with them, so we're able to have some decision-making power in where that bill goes into what committee. So probably we'll go into the Rules and Regulatory Committee. And then from there, it feels like a pretty easy move of passing it. We need 6 votes, and we have them all. Then the big challenge is going to go to the full House. Senate, I think, is going to be a lighter lift because we have more support. And there's less people in the Senate than in the House. We have not yet confirmed that all Democrats are going to say yes. Like, we have not gotten an explicit commitment from all Democrats. There's 56 of them, so we need to make sure that all of them have said explicitly yes, they're going to vote yeah. And we're working on that. That's something that we've been doing as part of We the People Michigan, as part of the coalition, to make sure that we have a confirmed yes, and as well as talking to a few key Republicans to also ask them to vote yes. We're hearing a lot of support and a lot of being like, yes, we think this is doable. We think this could happen and actually move fairly quickly. Some conversations that we've had with Democratic leadership have been saying that they think this could be moved on and passed as soon as by summer recess. So fingers crossed.
Fingers are crossed.
Most folks here, maybe their representatives are in Washington County, and most of them have, I think all of them have said yes to support. So what we really need is, if any of you live or have relationships in northern Michigan, rural parts of the state, the west side of the state, that's where we need the most help.
Yeah.
Maria, is there somewhere we can access the list of Democrats in particular that have not confirmed?
It's not a public list, but I can send it to you.
That would be great.
Mhm.
And as an FYI, you know, we send resources out to everyone who registered.
Mhm.
And we had a ton of people registered. So
Yeah,
that is
we
one
can send that out.
Yeah,
Mhm.
and we'll share it because
Yeah.
that, you know, is a great call to action.
Mhm.
Are there any other, so basically like people can engage in letter writing, people can come to events. What are some other ways or other action that we can do to support this?
Yeah, one of the biggest one is coffee house, attending coffee house. Wait, no, coffee hours. That's what it's called, not a coffee house. Attending coffee hours with legislators. We found that it's actually very easy, not as intimidating as meeting directly with them in their offices. They're often pre-scheduled and shared out on social media, and they're like a much less intense way to ask them. It's also really good to get a sense of like, what are their other constituents important, like thinking about, like, what are they talking about? And we have a list as well as of upcoming coffee hours that we've seen, and we'll share that out. So that's a big one. And if you have any relationships with legislators, think personal relationships and doing a little bit of like peer pushing to be like, who are you friends with? Like, you know, for example, Jeff Irwin, like, are you friends with anybody here that you know has not fully supported? Like, who are your relationships with, and how do we make sure that you're having those conversations with them, with your other peers?
Yeah, please do send us that list
Mhm.
of Democrats that are on the fence. And then, I mean, part of our charge as social workers is really mobilizing to get this work done. Is there other, well, can you also explain a bit about how these bills change? Like what exactly do they address? I know that, oh, go ahead, Maria.
Yeah, so it's sent right now, as the law states, is that somebody must prove, and this applies to more than just people who are undocumented, but it says that somebody must prove their Michigan residency. And in order to prove a Michigan residency, you must have a social security number and card to prove, to like show. So that's why a lot of people who are documented do not have IDs, is because they don't have the proof of the social security number, or they don't have a birth certificate. You don't have to have a US birth certificate, but if you're undocumented, you do have to have a social security number that comes under the Michigan residency. So the law would change to remove that requirement of having a social security number, as well as update the kinds of documents that could be used to prove your residency and your identity. I don't know the specific list of like what's going to be added to it. That's something that we're working on with the Secretary of State, to be able to expand, similar to the Washington County ID or the Detroit ID, to expand the kinds of documents that you can use to prove who you are, in addition to not having a requirement that you have a social security number.
Is there anything that any of the other panelists want to add to this?
I do. I would really want to advocate for removing the birth certificate from the required list, because if you think about the kind of document it is, I mean, what I've always argued is it's probably the easiest document to forge. So for those people that are, you know, concerned about fraudulent, you know, identity, it's a weak document. There's no photograph, right? There are 1,000 more documents that are more secure, better ways to prove identity. And I would really hope that they might look at, and perhaps you could speak about those individuals that, for instance, law enforcement have already fingerprinted and identified. Like if you have served time in a Michigan correctional institution, I don't understand why they have to reprove who they are. And if you're jailed under one identity, shouldn't that be forever proof, right? So just, I mean, if we could get away with really remove the birth certificate, I think it would open up opportunities for lots of folks.
Yeah.
I just want to add, I echo Kata, because for someone who doesn't have a birth certificate, I support that. My suggestion how to get involved would be to actually get to know these community members. I think that will take away the fear, and to actually have a real life relationship with these community members. They have the same dreams, the same aspirations. They want to have a better life. And it's just ridiculous that they can't go to work or have access to go to the hospital without being worried about getting pulled over or just discriminated against. And I would advocate that we push our politicians, not just, talk the talk, but do, walk the walk. Talk to these politicians, put some pressure on them and make your vote count. Make sure that you do vote and vote for these politicians who support immigrants. And I just want to say that, just also educate yourself. Know that, the immigrants that come here, we do not drain the economy. We actually add jobs. We're very vital to the economy. We're also here part of the food source. Without us, we would not be able to have food. So those are the kind of things that I think that we can advocate for as social workers to kind of bring that narrative that we are all the same. It shouldn't be them versus us. We are a community, and I wanted to, solidarity is very important if we're going to pass anything, for us to stick together. And just to reiterate, an injustice to one is an injustice to all.
Mhm. Oh, one more thing, we're what I forget, but Jerry Clayton, Washtenaw County Sheriff,
Mhm.
is not running for reelection. It's a great opportunity, I think, to really begin to organize around his successor, changing all policies concerning traffic stops and what's permissible when someone is stopped.
Yeah. That is important.
Mm.
And I want us just to think about, I mean, this was informative. It was a lot, right? There's a lot of complex policies and laws and changes that are required. But I hope that a message that we as social workers can take from some of this is for us to understand this stuff is so important, because we see people in an environment. That's how we approach the work. And if we approach individuals and we think that some of the things that are deficient or that they're having problems with are individual based, and we don't realize that, like, no, there's a whole structure built around them that's preventing them from accessing employment or food or healthcare. It's another thing that lack of access to an idea is. It's a public health issue, right? Then we're not really seeing the whole problem. Then we're not able to really see, how are people being affected by the environment? I want to open it up for I know we have about a few minutes left. Any questions from the audience? If you have anything, please type it in the chat. In the meanwhile, if there's anything the panelists also want to share kind of as closing remarks.
The one thing I wanted to be sure to encourage everyone who works with folks on a one-on-one basis. If you run into anyone who needs a government issued ID, get in touch with the Washtenaw ID Project, because we can get them one within 48 hours, and they might be in a hospital or a shelter. But we've now got it set up so that we can go to them if they can't go to the county clerk's office. And sometimes people need an ID just that quickly.
Yeah, yeah. In fact, I was going to share some information on a slide we have about how you can get a Washtenaw County ID. All right, we have a question in the chat from Katie Beasley. Do you want to unmute yourself and you can go ahead and ask this?
Certainly, one moment. Hi, thank you so much for this wonderful and informative presentation. I work in the School of Social Work, and I'm a social worker, and I've long had an interest in immigrants' rights work. So thank you for sharing all this helpful information with all of us. So my question was, I remember back around 2015, 2016, when I first moved to Michigan, there was a push in Washtenaw County to get folks to register for these IDs, the ones that are, I don't know the proper term, but non-licensed type IDs distributed by the county in an effort to kind of normalize them and to show solidarity with our undocumented neighbors. So I was wondering if this is something that is still like a helpful action to take, and if there are any actions that we can take to maybe like take it one step further now in 2023.
Yes, there still is a need for that support because, we don't want folks whose primary ID is the Washtenaw County ID to be in the position of having to introduce and explain the card. And that's something that allies can really take, they can take that burden on. When we did those initiatives, it was in partnership with the School of Social Work. So if you think that it's possible to launch another campaign, please give me a call, get in touch, and let's do that.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. What's the easiest way to get in touch with you? Or maybe we can talk privately if you don't want to
Yeah,
put it
no,
out
it's
there.
I'll send my Gmail account. Yeah, that's
Okay,
easy.
great. Yeah, I'm sure plenty of people in the School of Social Work would be happy to be involved with that.
Just so everybody knows, it was the School of Social Work that powered this thing. We had 4 grad student interns, and they then reached out to the undergrad association, I forget the name, and we found we had 30 or so hands and minds really helping us with this push. So yes, please get in touch.
That's
Thank you.
great.
Mhm.
Thank you, Katie. And yeah, we are going to share out, this, I wasn't able to show the PowerPoint, but thank you, Fatima, for stepping in. It has a lot of information. We're going to share that. We're going to share any resources that any of our panelists want to share. If there's actions coming up, if there's information that you forgot to share, send it to me, as well as your contact information. And we'll send it out to everyone who registered. Is there anyone else who'd like to ask a question, or any of the panelists that want to give some closing remarks?
Aisha, if I could just jump in really quickly, it's Trina. My social work 509 class, the macro practice class, worked with the Ann Arbor Human Rights Commission, and one of the groups talked about IDs, and I think they met with you, Keita Cowan, and so they did a whole presentation on a potential campaign. They weren't selected by the commission to actually report that particular session, but I'm sure some of the students will be willing to share that information they came up with, and I don't know who the best group, because they're probably graduating this semester, but if I have their slides. I have that, but I can reach out to them to see if they'd be willing to kind of ramp those ideas up.
Yes, that's wonderful. I wondered what had happened. I knew they weren't selected, but then I didn't know, well, was an action plan created? So it was. So we would love, that would be wonderful.
Aisha, you're muted.
Oh, sorry, everyone. I want with that, and thank you for sharing that. I think it's inspirational that social workers have helped already be involved in this, and that we need to continue to, right? Because we really do exist on the intersection of policy and people. being on the front lines in communities. And we have to remember that like the people affected are those who should lead this effort, not us, right? I want
And-
to. Oh,
sorry.
go ahead. No, go.
I just wanted to mention that in my experience, and I've worked with now grad students from many grad schools, including the law school. So the School of Social Work students that come out with the resources and the skill sets, both to organize and work with folks on an individual basis in a way that does not generate fear or anxiety. It's amazing to watch them work.
That's so great to hear. Because we really do try, we learn about this. And then I think that you're only really able to practice it when you're in the community, about approaching communities from a strength-based perspective and really being aware of your positionality, like in your privilege, right? And that you are not here to speak for other people as a mouthpiece or be some do-gooder. You're here to help other people see their power and then help them find that spotlight to make real change. I want to thank you all for the amazing work that you do and for sharing it with us today. It's really inspirational, and I'm so happy to hear that there's going to be real policy change that's happening this year. So just a few just closing things from Engage, housekeeping things. So you can visit our website to see our full list of past discussions. As a reminder, you can get field credit for attending the session today. You just have to go talk to your field faculty. You please stay tuned for our fall 2023 lineup of virtual discussions, and that should be released early August. And there is also going to be our Engage Community mini course class happening as well that will revolve around these discussions. So keep an eye on that, enroll if you're interested. Okay, thank you everyone. Thanks for all the work you do. Have a good one.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody.